Someone once told me you can tell how many people went to Catholic school by who's in the room on time. So perhaps some of you did. Okay, so my name is Janesse Brewer, and I'm here to facilitate, it's actually a little bit different format, so it's a set of interviews. So we're going to have some back and forth and some dialogue. Each of the presenters will not be giving a presentation at the beginning, but they will get the last word, so you can have some closing comments at the end. So here's who's with me today. We've got, first of all, Dr. Lori Marino, who's the Executive Director of the Camilla Center for Animal Advocacy and the President of the Whale Sanctuary Project. Thanks for being here, Lori. John Racanelli, President and CEO of the National Aquarium.
It's obvious.
It's obvious who you are. Dr. Naomi Rose, marine mammal scientist with the Animal Welfare Institute. And then Courtney Vale on the end there, who is the principal with Lake Keepers. So welcome to all the panelists. So in terms of the interview session, I did a couple things in preparation for today's session, which is I wrote emails to about 15 people from different sectors. And I wrote to people who are in the tourism industry. I wrote to people who work within aquariums and institutions. I worked and wrote to regular Joes on the street who have an interest in ethics and have an interest in animals. And I also wrote to researchers and advocates and said, hey, I've got this golden opportunity. I'm wondering what kinds of questions you would like to ask, because I've got some of my own too. So I use that as a basis for the kinds of conversation that we're going to have today. I want to start first, and by the way, you can see in your description that we're talking today about the aquatic environment, so aquariums specifically and aquatic animals as it pertains to welfare and ethics. So I want to start first with the scientists and the researchers who are on the panel. So this is a question for Lori and for Naomi. So we've talked a lot about ethics and the ethical questions and constructs that come to bear. But I'm curious, should we be thinking about aquatic animals as all the same within the aquarium setting? So how do you think about it?
Well, I think that, every species is different, obviously. But there's one realm of welfare that doesn't seem to work very well, and that is what happens to dolphins and whales when you put them in concrete tanks. The reason this doesn't work is because of the fact that dolphins and whales are self-aware beings who know not only who they are, but what their circumstances are. And unlike what some people might think, we are not the only animals with big brains. Dolphins and whales have brains that are extremely large and complex. Their cognitive abilities are enormous. And all of this intelligence and awareness actually makes them more vulnerable to living in a concrete tank than less. So it's actually, their intelligence actually makes them more vulnerable to what happens to them in captivity.
So looking at it from an ecological point of view and taking into account the cognitive differences, some aquatic life can be provided environments in captivity that are pretty sophisticated. We've got some aquariums that are providing kelp forest ecosystems to kelp forest denizens, and we have some aquariums that are providing coral reef environments to coral reef denizens. And so the inhabitants of those exhibits may not have the cognitive ability to recognize they're not actually in the wild because of the sophistication of the exhibits they're provided. Paradoxically, the most cognitively sophisticated aquatic animals that are held in captivity are held in the most barren environments. And I think that's a logistical problem. It's a management and husbandry problem for facilities because, it's difficult to keep them in hygienic conditions without keeping them in relatively barren environments. But cognitively and from a welfare perspective, it's backwards, and it's a problem, a challenge, a management issue that hasn't been dealt with, in my opinion, very well over the years.
Thanks. And then a question just building off of that then. I'm wondering, John, from your perspective as the CEO of an aquarium, and also then Courtney, from your perspective and working in the policy realm. So our sanctuaries, I think everyone knows probably that all 4 of these panelists are involved in one way or another in sanctuary efforts. So the National Aquarium formally announced last June that they were going to move their colony of dolphins to a sanctuary setting. And then president of the Whale Sanctuary Project, and then advisors or board members of the Whale Sanctuary Project. So I'm curious, are sanctuaries in response to ethical concerns and questions, or community concerns, or evolving perspectives from communities, or is it scientific?
Well, there's been a mistake. We're actually doing a snapping shrimp sanctuary. I meant to qualify that. I think that there are practical and there are ethical considerations. The practical ones have to do with the fact that, as Dr. Rose just said, our capacity to provide a suitable home for free-ranging, migratory, large-brained, deep-diving, fast-moving animals, which could include dolphins and some whales, most whales, is challenged. We figured out that if we were able to take the entire inner harbor of Baltimore and enclose it and put a dome over it, it would still be a small habitat for the dolphins, and relatively speaking to their world at large. So as we think about the ethics and the challenges of welfare, obviously that's a consideration we made. That was a practical consideration too, though, because we can't provide in our setting the right parameters. That's not to say that might not be possible in some other places, but in a cold climate where the water is too cold, where the air is often too cold for these animals that migrate to southern waters in the winter, we can't provide them with a natural habitat, and we can't even provide them with an open sunlight habitat. So that was a big part of our consideration. But it's really, we felt that this was important to how we care for the dolphins and the audiences that we serve. And between the two, the message was this is an appropriate move to make. The other thing that doesn't get said much is that we really wanted to free up the space to really focus more deeply on our conservation mission in all the other areas that we, in fact, do. And this gives us the opportunity to do things like maker spaces, enhanced classrooms, a live digital presentation space, a lot more things that we are space constrained at doing, and therefore are excited about gaining back 83,000 square feet. So those are a few considerations at play. One last thing, I guess, and then I'll pass it on to you, Courtney. Naomi, you also mentioned the part about the relative sterility of the environment, and it's become clear to me that we could keep our dolphins alive perhaps longer, certainly under more controlled conditions, if we were to just sort of fence off the dolphin facility in Baltimore and keep them there for the rest of their natural lives. Though it's hard to imagine that they would be natural lives in that setting, and it's a real adjustment for our staff, our caregiver staff, to acknowledge that they're going to be moving them to a life that has many more variables, some of which can be life-threatening and injurious, and yet they are acknowledging that, and it's taken a while to get there, that this is going to enhance the well-being of the dolphins. So the first steps in that include things like letting the algae grow in the tank so that they're a little bit more robust in terms of their ability to withstand some of the spores and larvae that'll be floating around in the water now. And we get complaints every day now. We have signs up that say, "Why is the algae growing?" And we try to tell the story, but we have created a set of expectations as a society that are hard to break, and one of them is sterile tanks.
Just from a policy perspective, we have seen kind of the messy middle where our decision-making aligns or does not with ethics, and it's informed by public sentiment, it's informed by politics, it's informed by the science. And I would suggest that the science only gets us so far, because science doesn't always necessarily inform our value judgments. So we might say science says we can cull 333 minke whales in the Southern Ocean, but should we? And so when we look at a policy perspective, we've already quickly acknowledged that marine mammals, per se, are special in kind and in discussion because they've been afforded special protection in law. We know that the literature shows us that there's, it's pretty conclusive that they perhaps don't thrive in captivity. They might adapt, but then that leaves us with a value judgment of should they be there. Marine mammals, more than any other species and taxa, will require us to justify their confinement, what value and at what cost. So I think the idea of sanctuaries actually helps us unravel that a little bit to look at a more humane or more natural future, and also be forward-thinking about the impacts of our policies, because as we've seen, public attitudes have shifted. And we have nearly 500 bottlenose dolphins in captivity in the United States alone. If public attitudes shift enough and corporate business models follow suit, and there are animals that are caught in the middle of our public debate and our evolution of ethics, we're going to need real solutions. And I feel more than anybody that we are all obligated to come up with those solutions. And although our ideologies are often black and white, the solutions aren't. And I'm a fan of incrementalism, so I think that we make step by step and stepwise choices to get us to the next level of where we want to be. I really appreciated Jenny Gray's presentation yesterday, and those easy boxes are easy, and those other two boxes where an individual is compromised and a population isn't, or vice versa. The captivity of marine mammals is that interface, because you have individual welfare that directly is involved with conservation. Unfortunately, if you look at captivity of marine mammals, there's a life cycle from acquisition in the wild to transportation to confinement. And every point along that spectrum requires a policy decision, and there's an opportunity to address welfare impacts. We know that acquisition from the wild still occurs. So from a policy perspective, we're looking also at the ethic of sanctuaries. And I would challenge all of us in this room to think about where our boundaries end. Is it just within your facility, or is there a role for zoos and aquaria to be advocates and to also push policies that are humane? And other countries around the globe perhaps don't have the same protections that we do here in the United States. And so there's an obligation of the industry as a whole, I think, to help shape what that looks like in other countries.
Good, thanks. So I feel like we'd be remiss if we don't at least circle back and touch just a little bit on the snapping shrimp question. So I think one of the things that you hear whispered in the halls of aquariums and zoos, because I myself have heard them, and I have the same questions, which is, so if folks concede, and not all do, that marine mammals, it's appropriate, that not all animals should be in aquariums, depending on what the confines are, and that sanctuaries are an appropriate answer to that, then the question becomes, so what's next? So does it become a slippery slope? Is it a cascade of questions around other species and other animals? So it's a question that I've heard. I'm curious, John, from your perspective, how do you think about that question? And then from any of the other panelists, how would you respond when you hear that?
Well, Naomi touched on it. It is true that there are species that we can provide a suitable environment where we can kind of answer those questions about whether the captivity is humane, is justified, and is effective. And those are usually habitat-based exhibits in our world, exhibits where we recreate, to the best of our ability, painstakingly recreate habitats or ecosystems, or replications of ecosystems, and then allow animals to live there in communities. Because what's kind of different about aquariums from zoos is that there are very few exhibits in aquariums that are species specific. They are more commonly habitat specific, and there are a multiplicity of species in those exhibits. We took actually the tank that originally had dolphins in it at the opening of the National Aquarium back in '81. We took that tank and turned it into, just in the last few years, something called blacktip reef, which is an Indo-Pacific coral reef. It's all fake coral, but it's all replicated and beautifully recreated to look and act and actually even respond like coral, except in one way: you cannot eat it, which some of the animals figure out the first time they try. It's a little bit less pliable, which is good because then it's still there for the next day and the next. But there are 100 species and over 1,000 animals in that exhibit, ranging from tiny little tetras and gobies and flame devilfish to a 520-pound sea turtle. So, and Calypso, that sea turtle, the rescue turtle, she views that as her domain, and she doesn't migrate and she doesn't beach and lay eggs. But other than that, she pretty much thrives in that exhibit and does it using the same kinds of survival tactics that she would have in nature. I think we can do that with many, but there are emerging questions around animals like octopuses, which are now being discovered to be incredibly cognitive with a completely different brain evolution. And I think one by one we've got to assess those. That's a reasonable thing for us in the zoo and aquarium world to do, to look at the animals in our exhibits and our populations and figure out if in fact we can still answer those questions about justifiable and humane and effective.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what you're saying, John. And I think that this notion of a slippery slope, when it's put in those terms, it makes it appear that, you know, we're sliding down the slope and at the bottom, you know, there's going to be something really awful, you know. But really what this is about is being mindful, being self-reflective, and really, you know, keeping the animals as the priority. So if we learn that a certain animal is not doing well in a certain environment, we're responsible for responding to that. So it's not so much a slippery slope as just actually, honestly putting the well-being and the lives of the non-human animals first and foremost.
So one of the things that I've really appreciated in the last couple of days is I'm very focused on marine mammals. I'm a marine mammal person. But I operate within the public display community debate. And so when I come to an event like this where it's the zoo community, the aquarium community, I learn a lot of things. I did not realize there was so much evaluation going on, and I really appreciate, Ron, you inviting us and allowing us to learn all of this. And so I've been actually really heartened to see that this debate is as lively within the zoo community as it is outside of the zoo community and within the public. And I haven't heard anything in the last couple of days that is, you know, outside of the norm of what I've been talking about for the last, 25 years. And all I see here in a very positive way is evolution. Let's use a nice scientific biological term there. I see evolution. I don't see it as a slippery slope, but it's just change. Change is hard, change is difficult, change is scary, but change is normal. Life is change. Businesses change. Business models change. And so I see this as very healthy. I'm really pleased to have been exposed to it. And honestly, nothing certainly that I have been advocating for the last 25 years is outside of the scope of the discussion that's been held here. One of the things that, yes, sanctuaries, they're sanctuaries for elephants, they're sanctuaries for tigers, they're sanctuaries for great apes. There's no sanctuary for cetaceans. And all we're trying to do is fill that gap and offer that as an alternative when things happen, like a facility has to shut down or, there's a hurricane. I mean, all of those things have actually resulted in the closing of facilities and animals needing homes. There's never been an alternative except sending them sometimes to a less suitable facility. So, again, nothing I think that's been discussed outside in the NGO community or the policy community is really different than the conversation I've heard the last couple of days.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's, when you think about innovative and thoughtful industries and organizations, they're constantly reevaluating. and looking at the constructs by which they make decisions. So I don't necessarily see it as a slippery slope, but actually when you are trusted more than NGOs and more than government, there's an obligation to always be reevaluating what that looks like for the animals that you care for.
I'll just round out the edges on the discussion about that. When I hear slippery slope, I think of threat or fear or defensive posture, a fear that this community, this industry, this practice, and everything, how it's evolved is going to become obsolete. And I think that's a false dichotomy. We heard about binary decisions and black boxes and all sorts of, ideas about how change can impact the relevancy of zoos and aquaria. And I do think they're relevant more now than ever. And I think it's not about abolition, it's about reform. And so a sanctuary may, for instance, allow, more unique and deeper opportunities for research that is more relevant to application to conservation of marine mammals in the wild, for instance. And some of us were at a workshop at the Society for Marine Mammalogy, and there was a defensive posture, again, from the research community that if you shut down all of the tanks, you lose your opportunity. You lose your opportunity for knowledge, and you lose your opportunity for applied science. And we would say that sanctuaries just provide yet another opportunity to, look into the lives of these animals in perhaps a more natural way.
When I hear slippery slope, I think of skiing or snowboarding. And generally speaking, you point your skis downhill and you enjoy the ride.
As a Coloradan who lives at 9,300 feet, I totally agree. So, okay. By the way, what I'd love to see, too, is if you have questions already, can you start to just get those to the folks who are collecting them? And then I might paraphrase or categorize them, but would love to start to collect those and feed them into our conversation and dialogue here. So let's talk a little bit about the opportunities for science and research. So I know I've really been interested in hearing about all the different methodologies and the opportunities as you are thinking about the beginning, the planning stages, the beginning, the middle, and the end of sanctuary science and moving animals from one kind of environment into another kind of environment. Are there particular methodologies or questions that you think, gosh, we have the ability to make great contributions in terms of welfare science? So.
Well, I would say that, when we talk about welfare science and sanctuaries, we have to keep in mind that the kind of science that you might be able to do would be the kinds of science that is in keeping with the principles of an authentic sanctuary. And an authentic sanctuary is going to put the well-being and the thriving of the animals first and foremost. So within that framework, you can start to think about creative ways to gather data and to gain insights into these animals. But, if you breach that principle, then it is no longer a sanctuary. It's a research lab or a zoo. So my feeling is that it is extremely important to do the science of observation, non-invasive observation, data collection, and to do that rigorously and to do that continuously throughout the operation of a sanctuary, even before, because we want to look at how do the animals respond to change in the circumstances and how their well-being might be better or worse or the same. So we need to have all those data, and it's extremely important. But we also have to keep in mind that the reason the animals are there in the sanctuary is not for us. We're there for them.
Right now, my feeling is that if you look at captive whales and dolphins and seals and sea lions and marine mammals in general, but particularly cetaceans, it's a resource that's underutilized from a scientific point of view. Interestingly, again, something I've learned in the last couple of days about how much welfare science is, in fact, going on with other species in zoos. Comparatively speaking, there's very little welfare research having been done on cetaceans in captivity. There's some, definitely some, but I'm talking about relative. It's really quite meager compared to welfare science on almost any other terrestrial species or even bird species you can imagine. And I have a lot of different suppositions as to why that's so, but I actually don't know anything because that community is very defensive toward our advocacy. And again, as Courtney pointed out, we've been told in so many words, this isn't even in code, it's if you end the public display of cetaceans, you end cetacean research. And they're not even saying captive cetacean research. They're saying cetacean research, which I found absolutely bizarre because the vast majority of cutting-edge research is now done in the field.
Let me address that. First of all, I think I need to make sure I issue a disclaimer here, and that's that we're stepping up to do this. We were driven by a variety of factors. I've already outlined some of them: practical, ethical, care-driven, et cetera. But others are at different stages of their evolution, and I don't want to imply that we think that we somehow, have the high ground here, and everybody else that keeps a dolphin or a whale is somehow, doing wrong. And not that I'm hearing that here, but I mean, I think it's important I mention that. We have colleagues who have done remarkable things. In the audience here is Stuart Strahl. Brookfield Zoo has sponsored the longest-running study of native or wild dolphins in existence, and that's the work of Dr. Randy Wells down in Sarasota, who's seconded to Mote Marine. And it's a remarkable body of research, and it's been a really valuable tool, I think, for understanding the lives of dolphins in the wild and also being able to compare and contrast those lives with the lives of dolphins in human care. That said, I also concur with the other panelists that a sanctuary, whether for whales or dolphins, is going to present huge opportunities for non-invasive research governed by a principle. In our case, in fact, we had this before that other guy did. We were saying dolphins first, and then Janess, you said, well, gee, actually, didn't Trump you on that one, but America first? No, we've been saying dolphins first in our planning for this for the last couple of years now, and we really do want it to be driven by that, but to enable opportunities to learn more about these animals and their analogously to learn more about the plight of those in the wild. And certainly, people like Janet Mann at Georgetown, who is the person who perfected the technique of collecting chuff samples, that is saliva that's issued in small amounts every time a marine mammal breathes, learned that at the National Aquarium and a few other places that have animals in close contact, but now can use it in the wild to sample DNA without intrusively taking blood or tissue samples. So I think that's one tiny analogous instance where there will be hundreds available to us as we open the aperture wider and take the pressure off the dolphins, because the truth is today they have to work for their living. Somebody made that comment earlier about zoo animals work for their living, and they will still work for their living. That's also called stimuli. But it will be a different form of work for your living in a sanctuary setting, because the main emphasis will be on interaction with them for, of course, husbandry and care, and also for non-invasive and useful research that's enabled by that setting.
So we're getting loads of questions. So let's go ahead and start. Okay, I'm going to categorize them and paraphrase them. So there are several questions about the vaquita. And so I think most everyone is aware of that issue, and just curious how the panel is thinking about that. So people have asked it in the context of breeding, but also just capture and captivity.
So just so everybody understands, my organization, the Animal Welfare Institute, is involved in a coalition of NGOs that are working with the scientists of CIRVA, which is the group that advises policymakers on the vaquita issue, and the Mexican government on trying to solve this rather horrific conservation dilemma. So given that background, the effort to capture the remaining vaquita and place them basically in sanctuary. I mean, they're not going to be leaving Mexico. They're going to be staying in the habitat there, because the habitat in and of itself is not damaged. It is more than enough to support these animals. The problem is what's in the habitat, which is not pollution per se, although that's there, but not in tremendously negative amounts. It's nets, it's gill nets. And if those gill nets come out of the water, just modeling, the vaquita would have recovered. It may very well be at the level where that is no longer true, and hence this plan to capture the remaining animals. And actually, the plan is to keep them safe, not to have them breed in captivity, because quite frankly, the odds of them breeding in captivity are very poor. One, porpoises don't breed in captivity as well as dolphins do. And two, this particular porpoise is super shy, super vulnerable to stress, and may not survive the capture, let alone breed once it's confined. So that's all supposition, that's all speculation. We don't actually know how the animals are going to react. So this is a last-ditch, desperate effort to save a species from extinction. And the zoo community, the aquarium community is involved. There are porpoise experts in Europe in particular who are involved, who know better than anybody how to handle at least one species of very closely related porpoise, and that is excellent. And it's just the sort of thing that we can all find common ground on, and I'm 100% supportive of that effort. But I have to tell you, when I say supportive of that effort, I mean supportive of the cooperation. I personally think this plan will not progress very far because I have a great fear that the first animal that is spotted and captured will likely die of stress, capture myopathy. It is just my opinion, but it is not, I'm not the only one who holds that opinion. It is shared by many of the people who are actually pursuing this plan because it is a last-ditch, desperate effort. So I urge the zoo and aquarium community not to present this as the solution. We won't know if it is or it isn't until it happens, which won't be until October. And to be brutally honest, by October, there may be none left. That's how fast they're disappearing. The nets are in the water. They can't get them out of the water. Bizarrely enough, Sea Shepherd, who is not necessarily an NGO I'm terribly, collegial with, is doing the best work of all because they're actually on the ground there pulling the nets out of the water. Every net that's in the water right now is illegal, every single one. So it's easy to do. I'm just urging us all to be realistic about the odds of this working and realistic about how we're presenting this to the public and not grabbing too much of the limelight or too much of the credit for something that may or may not work. We have to see how this is going to work before we start talking about it too publicly, in my opinion.
Any others want to talk about that, the issue that Vicki did?
On behalf of AZA, I will say that the organization has raised a large amount of money to try to help the process, and I think that's terribly important.
No, I totally agree. Sorry, yeah. I meant to say that, and I know that financial contribution was hugely valuable. I meant to say that, sorry.
Thank you. But I also know that it is an incredibly intractable issue because for those who don't know, it's driven by an illicit trade in the gallbladders of the totoaba fish?
Swim bladders.
So, swim bladders. So unfortunately, these bladders are valued at $30,000 in some Asian countries, and the demand for them is huge. And the only solution that I've heard that might be viable is aquaculturing the totoaba to try to somehow flood the market with swim bladders of totoaba, which seems like a scary solution. But be that as it may, this is one of those moments where the humane thing to do is perhaps not the biologically or population biology wise the best solution, but it's the humane thing, and it becomes a question of whether the 30 or 40 lives that are still to be saved are worth saving at this incredible cost. And it's a real conundrum. I don't know where to sit on it myself. I have gone back and forth on the advisability of doing
as well. I mean, I don't think this is a situation where any of us are comfortable with what's happening. It's the devil in the deep blue sea.
I would just add, it is somewhat of a scientific experiment, and it also shows us the limitation, I think, of where even the best and brightest minds can only come up with a last-ditch effort. For instance, yesterday we heard about Pelorus Island and the situation with the dingoes and exploding collars and the goat problem, and I would say that is doomed, not only from a public relations perspective, but probably from an ecological one as well. But in any event, we have another test case here where we failed to get on the front end of the Yangtze, the Baiji. There was contemplation there to do the same thing, to try to capture those remaining individuals and see if they could breed. We won't know, but I hesitate as well to forecast the success of this, but it just speaks to more about how policies are not just about science, it's also about, public attitudes, doing the right thing and what we think the right thing at the time is. And at the end of the day, if this is all we have, this is all we have. And there's going to be a cost associated with it. So we'll learn from this. And unfortunately, I wish we had learned 30 years ago to regulate the fishing industry and their habitat, right? We all do. So.
And I just wanted to say one last thing. The Baiji is actually a good example of an intractable problem because it was multi-layered. This was a river that was degraded, had many people living on it. The solution was very much not clear. How do you clean up a river, get people to stop fishing in it, stop people from even using it as a waterway? There were so many things going on in the Yangtze. This is very simple. The nets are in the water, they have to be out of the water. And we still couldn't fix it because of fishermen needing a livelihood, because of, quite frankly, an illegal poaching situation where a lot of money was involved, violence, political intractability. It was a purely human problem. Somebody else said earlier in the conference that, conservation is about people. It's not about animals. This is absolutely Exhibit A on that.
And just to add to that, to put in a plug for the Toa-toba, they're going extinct as well due to overfishing. So the whole thing is a mess.
Good, thank you. Yeah, it's a really difficult issue, and it's a good example too of how there are unlikely bedfellows who have come together to try to really work on this issue and find their way through it. So it struck me that it's very much in that grid of difficult situation. So let's go ahead and leave that issue for a moment and talk a little bit about leadership and whose ethics. So I think even if there starts to become a consensus in some places around the world around the appropriateness of marine mammals to be in aquariums, depending on what the situation is, then what are the implications for other places, especially when you think about it? So there is science, there are ethics that are helping to inform that, there are public views and perspectives that are evolving, but that is not true everywhere. So I'm thinking particularly about the Middle East and about Asia. So is there a role from a leadership perspective there?
Only if we can lead by example. And that's, we Americans, I'll speak especially to our non-American colleagues in the room today, we have a bad habit of learning the hard way how to do something and then running around and telling everybody, hey, I know how to do it. Sometimes we get it right, but other times we look a little silly. And I think that collectively we do need to get our act together in terms of our welfare standards and our capacity for determining and then looking after the needs of these animals that we care for before we can try to tell China to not import dolphins and whales. That said, first of all, there are other sectors that I think don't have that conundrum at play. I think including some of the people that are on the stage with me, if you've got this strong conviction, you can carry it to any country. I think the hardest part and the most important part is that we in the zoo and aquarium world set out to try to provide some models for our colleagues, and especially in the developing world, although really at this point we can't call China the developing world anymore, but they are one of the biggest potential consumers of cetaceans for entertainment and other uses that we might not consider as enlightened as we'd hope. And so I think in both cases we have to provide them with models for where we've arrived and try to help them benefit from this long 100-year experiment that we've been conducting here in the U.S.
I would agree that we are a model, and we seem to people like to emulate what happens in the United States for good or bad. But it's also important to remember that poor animal welfare is not cultural. So despite the fact that people in X country or Y country might have a different view about how to relate to these animals, the animals themselves don't care. Their poor welfare is going to be poor whether they're in China or in the United States, Canada, or Dubai. So, again, it's keeping your eye on who is important here. And who is important here, if we all are on the same page, is the animal that and their well-being and their ability to thrive. And that should be a priority. And that doesn't change across human cultures.
So I agree with John that it's important for the zoo community to be very diplomatic about how it deals with this because, and just as an American, I know that this is a very serious problem. I work a lot internationally. I'm very active right now in China. And so you're right, we have a bit more freedom, but we are still outsiders. We can't go into any culture, anywhere. I've worked in the Caribbean, I've worked in Asia, and you can't just go in there and say, I know how to do it, so do it my way. That, as a policy matter, as a societal change matter, isn't going to work. So we always work with partners on the ground. We work very hard to develop coalitions with partners on the ground, and we are working within, my organization is working within a coalition on the ground. We have Chinese, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong members, as well as international NGOs, and all we're doing right now is public outreach, because working in China is a little tricky. And so we are just doing public outreach. We are doing lectures, events for children, social media. They have a very active social media scene. It's not our scene, but it's theirs, and we are very active in that arena. And we are hoping to change hearts and minds that way. There's a lot of lack of information in that society. They are not open to Western media. It's closed to Western media. There are some folks in China who can get around that, but not very many. And so they don't know. When they learn, they actually can very easily change their mind. They can absorb that and think differently. And so I think the zoo community definitely has a role to play because they can access forums that we cannot as an NGO. The Chinese Association of Zoos and Aquariums is a quasi-governmental body that I have, in fact, spoken with. They're open to this dialogue. They want to hear from outside perspectives. And so I think the zoo community, the WAZA, the AZA, the Alliance of Marine Mammal Parks and Aquariums should definitely insert itself diplomatically and collegially into that dialogue. I absolutely think there's a role to play.
I would just add, practically speaking, because I think many of us thirst for the practical side of things when, we hear theory and philosophy and, how are we going to be that change agent as an aquarium or as a zoo? And I think the most fundamental policy that could model the desirable direction and to influence other countries, burgeoning sometimes industry or facilities, is the acquisition policies of zoos and aquaria. And I think if you look specifically at marine mammals and whales and dolphins even more specifically, there is a really devastating life cycle for acquisition from the wild. And unfortunately, in places, let's give a specific example because, again, Jenny mentioned the drive hunt example in Taiji and the fishery there. And we know it's a ready and easy source and disposable source of dolphins. And nearly 100% of the dolphins in Japanese facilities are from the drive hunt. So with every aquaria that brings in dolphins or even has a dolphin program, whether that's entertainment or more legitimate research, unfortunately, most of the facilities that have whales and dolphins, the primary purpose is entertainment. That's how they're held. There's a lot of interaction with the public. So that's another area of conversation, but I think the acquisition policies that AZA, WAZA, every individual facility has could immediately impact the course and future of this issue.
Good. We have 1 minute left, but you get the final word. So whatever you want to say, there's a number of questions here. By the way, please, if your question didn't get answered, find these guys in the hallway. But last word, as you think about leadership from your particular sector or, things that we might work on together and collaboratively. Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Yep.
Knowing what we know about the cognitive capacity, the socialization, the brain development, all the other things that distinguish cetaceans, dolphins and whales, it would be completely unconscionable for our nation to ever foster the collection other than to save a species, I suppose, which is perhaps what we're going to experience in concert with Mexico with regard to the vaquita. But outside of that, I cannot imagine a reason to continue to collect cetaceans from the wild. I also think that it's probably time for us to think about whether we need to continue to perpetuate the captive collections of dolphins and whales, and whether we should find a way to, as humanely and with as much welfare awareness as possible, give them a chance to live out their lives and not necessarily procreate to continue this or perpetuate this.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. And I think that, we all know, what the data are saying about how dolphins and whales live in concrete tanks. I think it is absolutely crystal clear that they don't thrive. And I think that we all collectively have enough experience and understanding and expertise to do better. And I would also echo the fact that, as the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project, I see this as not just a sanctuary for a few fortunate residents, but as a way to change how we relate to these animals. And I'm hoping that others will follow suit, copy. We want to be extremely transparent, authentic, and we just want to do better for these animals. Give them back something of what was taken away from them when they were placed in concrete tanks for entertainment. And, we remain open to working with everyone. This is not a proprietary thing. This is about doing right for the animals. And I think all of us in this room want the same thing. And I look forward to a time when, we can actually sit down, talk, collaborate, and figure out how to do the right thing for animals that we haven't been relating to very well in the past. Naomi?
So I, obviously do not believe that whales and dolphins thrive in captivity. I believe the practice of displaying them for whatever zoo or aquarium purpose needs to end for their welfare. But that said, I'm a realist. And what I'm trying to do is come up with a win-win solution. I've used that phrase a lot in the writings I do, and I'm not just saying that. I want something that a solution that addresses growing public concern, that addresses business needs, that addresses animal welfare first and foremost. And so that's part of the purpose of the sanctuary movement. We're trying to come up with that solution, whether that eventually houses all 2,000 or more marine cetaceans in captivity globally. I think that's unlikely. So some of the animals are going to live out their lives in the facilities they're in. I'm okay with that. I'm looking at the big picture and the long play. But it starts with dialogue. It starts with coming together. It starts with finding common ground. And it starts with stopping being defensive. And if that requires, big change on the part of the NGO community, we're working on that. But it really does start with a change in the zoo and aquarium community as well, because we are not here to deconstruct, using another phrase from an unfortunate person. We're not here to deconstruct the zoo and aquarium cetacean display practice. We're here to phase it out in a humane way, humane for the animals, humane for the people. So I really hope that that's understood.
And I would just add that I would encourage all of us not to be afraid to draw those bright lines. We look at an evolution and a growth of an industry and a fear that it will, again, become obsolete and it might atrophy. But as I think we all can acknowledge there's a critical and vital role for zoos and aquaria, even more today. And so I think the policies that are in place as they incrementally are decided will change the course in the future of the public display of marine mammals, but specifically looking at the advocacy and the role of zoos and aquaria in developing that policy is really important. And I think that is where we can do that collaboratively and not be afraid to say, you know what, I think we agree that collectively, for all these reasons above, that certain marine mammals shouldn't be in captivity. And to use the word shouldn't, and that's okay. We heard folks sitting up here yesterday saying if it was found that a certain species did not thrive, even if it could adapt, it did not thrive, would you release it, disavow yourself of that exhibit? And the answer was yes. So I think that's a clear indication that we're willing to acknowledge that there's differences between species and some just aren't suitable.